Welcome to The Last Climb. I'm Alex, and today we're looking at an Everest climber who leaned heavily on an AI chatbot while building out her ascent plan. She treated planning like a controlled process. Checklists, thresholds, and procedures she trusted almost as much as her own judgment. Knowing how it ended, it's hard not to ignore how disturbingly fast control falls apart. It was May 4th, 2023, at Everest Base Camp in Nepal, sitting at roughly 17,600 feet on the moraine below the Khumbu icefall. The night was clear but cold as climbers began staging departures for their summit rotations into the higher mountain. Allison Marsh was a 29-year-old emergency room nurse from Fort Collins, Colorado, known among friends for her endurance discipline and methodical approach to high-altitude hiking. She had completed all 58 of Colorado's 14ers, built a multi-year training regimen, and approached expedition climbing less as an adventure impulse and more as a system to be mastered through preparation. Her Everest attempt was defined by an unusual kind of structure, a belief that complexity could be managed through documentation. Over 8 months, she built her expedition plan through extensive conversations with an AI chatbot, treating it as a reference point for logistics, physiology, and decision-making frameworks. She organized the information into binders, spreadsheets, and laminated field notes, aiming to remove uncertainty through preparation. Some climbers don't chase uncertainty. They try to engineer it out completely. Everest doesn't really allow that. By her mid-20s, she was logging winter ascents, tracking conditions, and treating each climb as incremental training data for something larger she had not yet named. That trajectory shifted after the sudden death of her father in 2021 during a hiking trip in southern Colorado. The event did not manifest in dramatic behavioral change, but in a more controlled intensity in her planning and goal setting. Everest, when it first appeared in her note, was framed less as ambition and more as a long-form project requiring precision. Grief didn't change her direction, it tightened it. By late 2022, she had begun formal expedition research. She studied route systems on the Nepal side of Everest, acclimatization protocols, supplemental oxygen use, and altitude illness progression. Her questions to the AI were specific and procedural, focused on operational details, gear thresholds by elevation, flow rates for oxygen systems, and recognition criteria for high-altitude medical emergencies. She compiled the responses into a structured field manual. The most important sections were printed out, color-coded, and laminated so they wouldn't get ruined on the climb. One page broke down altitude sickness symptoms and what to do about them in simple terms. Another explained how to use the oxygen system and adjust the flow rate as conditions got worse higher up. She also carried a small fingertip pulse oximeter and used it regularly at each camp, just to check how her body was handling the altitude. She wrote the readings down in a small notebook she kept in her pocket, along with short journal notes. It became a simple routine for her. Check, record, move on. Something to replace the absence of continuous medical oversight once she moved above base camp. The financial structure of the expedition was a central part of Allie Marsh's planning. A fully guided Everest climb with a Western operator in 2023 typically ranged from about $45,000 to $85,000, covering Western guides, on-mountain medical support, structured acclimatization, and higher levels of decision-making oversight above base camp. In high-altitude expeditions, cost differences often translate into decision authority, not just comfort. As an ER nurse working at a regional hospital in Colorado, her income made this level of support financially difficult without long-term saving. She compared that model with a semi-guided expedition, which was significantly cheaper and relied primarily on Sherpa support, fixed ropes, and logistics coordination, rather than a Western guide making real-time field decisions above base camp. Through her AI-assisted research, she explored the structural differences between these options, particularly around logistics, oxygen systems, and acclimatization planning. The distinction was clear on paper, but less tangible in terms of risk ownership at extreme altitude, especially in situations where medical or navigational judgment would need to be made quickly without external authority nearby. Over several months, she increased her workload, reduced expenses, and saved approximately $28,000. She ultimately selected a lower-cost semi-guided package with a Kathmandu-based outfitter for about $18,500, which included Sherpa support, permits, base camp services, and fixed rope infrastructure, but no Western guide or expedition physician on the mountain. Higher-level medical or logistical oversight would be available remotely from base camp. In late 2022, she began documenting her preparation on social media, sharing training logs, gear choices, and acclimatization note. By the time she arrived in Nepal in April 2023, she had built a modest but engaged audience of roughly 4,000 followers. The visibility added a layer of external awareness to the expedition, though her planning and decision-making remained internally driven and highly structured throughout the preparation phase. Her physical preparation over the 8 months before departure was deliberate and consistent. She maintained her endurance base built during her October 2022 marathon training and added weighted uphill carries to simulate the sustained load of climbing with a high-altitude pack. She regularly returned to Colorado's high country through fall and winter, completing progressively harsher objectives, including a whiteout ascent of Mount Massive in February, a pre-dawn winter climb of Long's Peak via the Keyhole route in sub-zero conditions, and a multi-day Sawatch Range traverse in late March that kept her above 14,000 feet for 3 consecutive nights. She also incorporated a portable altitude tent into her routine on select nights, using it to simulate reduced oxygen exposure during sleep. While the physiological benefits of altitude tents at home-simulated elevations remain debated in sports science, she included it as a marginal gains tool based on her research and low perceived downside. By spring 2023, she was in strong physical condition. At 29, she had a well-developed aerobic base, high tolerance for sustained effort at altitude by Colorado standards, and practical competence on alpine terrain. Her marathon time of 3:41 put her in the solid range of serious recreational runners. Nothing elite, but clearly someone disciplined enough to train consistently and stick with it. She wasn't chasing standout numbers anyway. It was simpler than that. She had a plan, and she followed it. Her training was built around what she believed Everest would demand, and she just kept showing up and putting in the work. By the time she left base camp that night, her system was complete on paper. But paper plans rarely include what fatigue feels like when it starts reshaping judgment. What remained untested was not her preparation, but whether preparation itself could function as protection in an environment where physiology, weather, and timing operate outside of any structured plan. The transition from the controlled environment of her Colorado training to the sensory overload of Nepal was the first variable her system couldn't quite capture. She arrived in Kathmandu on April 8, 2023, at roughly 4,600 feet, where the lower elevation felt noticeably denser after months spent living and training in Colorado's higher terrain. She spent a day recovering from travel and met her expedition team on April 9th at the outfitter's office. The group consisted of 12 climbers from multiple countries, communicating primarily in English despite it being a second language for most. Sirdar, an experienced Nepali logistics leader from the Khumbu region, conducted the briefing alongside a British operations manager based in Kathmandu. The manager outlined the expedition structure, confirmed logistics, and clarified that all remote support from that point onward would be handled from Kathmandu rather than on the mountain. Each climber was paired with a Sherpa guide. Ali's Sherpa had multiple Everest summits and significant experience across commercial expeditions. Communication between them was functional but limited, focused on pace, conditions, and basic safety signals rather than detailed medical or technical discussion. This was a standard limitation of the expedition format she had chosen, and it had not been treated as a central risk in her planning. The approach trek from Lukla to Everest Base Camp followed the standard Khumbu Valley route over 9 days, passing through familiar acclimatization stops like Namche Bazaar, Tengbochi, and Dingboch as she worked her way higher. The itinerary was structured specifically for gradual altitude gain and mandatory rest periods to support physiological adjustment. She moved through the trek without major issues. Her symptoms remained within expected norms for altitude exposure, including mild sleep disruption and reduced appetite. She tracked daily metrics such as oxygen saturation, hydration, and perceived exertion in her journal, treating them as part of a structured monitoring system. She arrived at base camp on April 12th and recorded her initial readings along with a brief note that the mountain appeared larger and more imposing than expected. She described the conditions as manageable and interpreted her stable response as validation of her preparation and acclimatization strategy. What she did not yet have visibility into was the variability of altitude illness onset. Early stability at base camp is common and can be misleading, as the physiological strain of sustained exposure often accumulates over several days. Her early comfort, while reassuring, represented only the beginning of a longer and less predictable predictable physiological curve. The first acclimatization rotation began on April 15th, following a standard Everest expedition profile: ascent through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, then to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet, before descending back to base camp for recovery. This rotation was consistent with widely used commercial acclimatization schedules. The Khumbu Icefall is a constantly shifting glacier between base camp and the western CWM, crossed using ladders placed by the icefall doctors each season. It is considered the most objectively hazardous section of the South Col route due to unpredictable ice movement rather than technical difficulty. Ali crossed it during a standard early morning window and reached Camp 1 without incident. She reported fatigue but no concerning symptoms and slept several hours that night, waking with a mild headache that resolved with ibuprofen. The following day, she moved into the western CWM toward Camp 2, a wide glacial basin that traps solar heat and increases dehydration risk despite the altitude. She arrived at Camp 2 at roughly 21,300 feet and recorded an oxygen saturation of 74% without supplemental oxygen. Her reference materials said readings in the low to mid-70s were typical at that stage, so she logged it and moved on. What didn't stand out in the moment was that a single reading doesn't say much on its own. What matters is how it changes over time, alongside symptoms and fatigue. Her numbers were technically still within the expected range, but they consistently sat toward the lower end. That pattern only becomes meaningful when viewed over time, especially in high-altitude conditions where small declines can matter. She returned to base camp on April 22nd, reporting that she felt well, consistent with her recorded metrics and her interpretation of the first rotation as successful acclimatization. The second acclimatization rotation began in late April and took her to Camp 3 at about 24,000 feet, the highest point she had reached. The ascent followed the standard South Col route through the Icefall, Western CWM, and Lhotse Face. Her approach was explicitly rule-based. She treated these as operational rules to follow unless clear emergency criteria were met. At Camp 3, she developed a sustained headache and mild nausea, symptoms she noted but did not immediately classify as abnormal within her checklist framework. Her oxygen saturation measured 69% without supplemental oxygen, low but still within the broad variability described in her materials. Her Sherpa recommended descending that evening, repeating the suggestion more firmly after observing her slower pace and reduced appetite. This is where structured rules begin to collide with changing physiology. She reviewed her laminated protocol before responding, mentally mapping her condition against the thresholds she had written months earlier. The checklist categorized stable headache and mild nausea as acceptable if oxygen readings remained within expected acclimatization ranges and no acute neurological symptoms were present. The decision wasn't emotional for her, it was procedural. She ran through the thresholds she had set earlier in the expedition. Because none of the key criteria clearly crossed a limit, she saw descent as unnecessary disruption to her acclimatization schedule and stayed the night, planning to reassess in the morning after rest and acetazolamide. She took acetazolamide, consistent with both standard expedition practice and the guidance she had incorporated into her plan. Overnight, her symptoms improved, and by the next day, the headache and nausea had resolved. She descended to base camp and recorded the rotation as successful, interpreting the outcome as validation that her structured approach was working as intended. What this sequence did not capture was the limitation of rule-based guidance in high-altitude environments. While the protocols were medically accurate in general terms, they could not integrate multiple borderline signals in real time the way continuous clinical judgment can, especially under conditions of hypoxia and fatigue. The rest period between early May was governed by weather forecasting and summit window planning. A narrow high-pressure system was expected to open a viable summit window lasting only a few days. She tracked these projections closely and aligned them with her own notes on summit congestion and timing strategy. By this stage, her earlier physiological signals, including low-end oxygen readings and a persistent dry cough consistent with the common Khumbu cough, remained unshared with other climbers. She interpreted conditions through the same structured framework she had used throughout the expedition, maintaining confidence in her planning system as the summit window approached. On the morning of departure, departure. She posted a final update from base camp, reflecting readiness and transition into the summit phase. She left base camp with her Sherpa during the standard night departure window, beginning the final push as the weather window opened. The climb from base camp to Camp 4 unfolded over roughly 40 hours of cumulative movement, with planned overnight stops at Camp 1 and Camp 2. She crossed the Khumbu icefall before dawn and reached Camp 1 without incident. From there, she continued into the western CWM, managing heat exposure and hydration deliberately as conditions warmed under intense solar reflection. The ascent to Camp 3 and onto the Lhasa face marked a clear increase in difficulty. She was carrying heavier summit gear at this point, and the fatigue from the climb was really starting to build up. Her pace slowed compared to the earlier rotations, and her Sherpa stayed closer as it became clear she wasn't moving the way she usually did. She eventually reached Camp 4 at the South Col in the afternoon and settled in to rest before the summit push. At 26,000 feet within the death zone, physiological decline becomes unavoidable, even with supplemental oxygen. During rest at Camp 4, she recorded an oxygen saturation of 68% on 3L-man oxygen. She repeated the measurement twice, adjusting her finger placement and waiting for a stable reading, but the results stayed the same. She had seen references suggesting that high 60s readings weren't unusual at extreme altitude, especially in heavily fatigued climbers during rest periods. Her notes focused more on variability than fixed thresholds, a framing she had relied on throughout the expedition. She cross-referenced the number with earlier Camp 2 and Camp 3 readings, noting that while the trend was downward, each individual value still fell within what her materials described as expected physiological spread at altitude. The absence of acute neurological symptoms, confusion, ataxia, or loss of coordination at rest reinforced her interpretation that the situation remained within manageable range. It required each data point to exceed its own threshold. As a result, she recorded the reading, acknowledged it as low but acceptable, and proceeded with rest preparation without escalation or external consultation. She proceeded with rest and prepared for the summit departure. She and her Sherpa left Camp 4 before dawn and entered the southeast ridge under headlamps shared across multiple teams. Several hours into the climb, her cough changed from dry to wet and productive, a shift that became more noticeable during pauses between fixed-line sections. To experienced Sherpas, cough changes are often more meaningful than numbers. The Sherpa initially observed without intervention, then increased his attention as the pattern repeated during the next rest break. His communication shifted from simple caution signals to much more direct pointing and gestures, telling her to go down. He kept indicating the route back toward descent, again and again. It was clear his tone had changed from just advising her to something more urgent, as he started to suspect she was developing a serious lung issue. She acknowledged the signal, but interpreted it within the broader context of summit timing, pressure, weather stability, and the distance already covered from Camp 4. In her framework, continued upward movement remained permissible unless a defined critical symptom threshold was reached. As a result, she chose to continue. At the balcony, after briefly removing her oxygen mask to clear her airway, she produced frothy, faintly pink sputum. The change was immediate and visible, and the Sherpa's response shifted sharply from urgency to direct intervention signaling, indicating descent with repeated insistent gestures toward the fixed line below. She paused longer than at previous decision points, reviewing her condition in real time against her laminated emergency sheet. The symptoms matched a category she had studied, late-stage high-altitude pulmonary edema, but the classification existed in her notes as a condition description rather than a mandatory stop trigger, unless accompanied by severe neurological impairment or rapid collapse. At the same time, she weighed the distance already gained, the limited evacuation options at that elevation, and the expectation that descent itself would require sustained physical output under worsening hypoxia. The decision space narrowed into competing constraints rather than a single directive. She acknowledged the Sherpa's signal, but did not reverse direction, instead shifting focus to equipment adjustment and medication preparation. She sent a brief satellite message noting her location and proximity to the summit without describing symptoms, then refocused on her equipment. She opened her medical kit and administered nifedipine, a calcium channel blocker she she had identified as standard field treatment for suspected HAPE. While nifedipine can act as a stabilizing bridge by lowering pulmonary arterial pressure, its effectiveness depends entirely on an immediate evacuation pathway. At roughly 27,600 feet on the southeast ridge, that condition no longer applied. Helicopter evacuation was not feasible, and self-assisted descent was severely constrained. Shortly afterward, she lost the ability to coordinate movement. Still on supplemental oxygen at the fixed line near the balcony, her lungs could no longer effectively exchange gas due to advanced pulmonary failure. She had not depleted her oxygen supply. Rather, her body had reached a point where oxygen could no longer be utilized. At approximately mid-morning on May 7th, 2023, Allison Marsh lost consciousness while still clipped to the fixed rope. Her Sherpa, unable to safely move an unresponsive climber at that altitude alone and facing his own rapidly declining oxygen reserves, followed standard expedition emergency protocol. He secured her position on the fixed line, marked her location, and descended to Camp 4 to request additional assistance. By the time help arrived, she was unresponsive and no longer showing signs of life. Her oxygen equipment remained in place and functional, indicating that supply was not the limiting factor. The assessment from expedition personnel was consistent with a progression of high-altitude pulmonary edema leading to severe cerebral hypoxia. The outfitter's Kathmandu-based operations manager notified the relevant diplomatic authorities in Nepal the following day. Her family in Fort Collins was informed shortly thereafter. A routine post-incident review was conducted by national mountaineering authorities and closed within a standard time frame, with no formal negligence finding against the outfitter. Her Sherpa's actions at each stage were determined to be consistent with established high-altitude emergency procedures. A voluntary Himalayan safety review later reconstructed the final phase of the climb, using expedition records, Sherpa testimony, and base camp equipment data. It identified her Camp 4 oxygen saturation of 68% on supplemental oxygen as a meaningful warning sign when interpreted in clinical context. The review concluded that real-time assessment by a clinician experienced in high-altitude medicine would likely have prompted immediate descent rather than continued ascent. Her personal phone and printed field materials contained AI-generated planning notes covering acclimatization, oxygen use, and altitude illness recognition. Independent medical reviewers later confirmed that the information itself was consistent with established high-altitude medicine literature, including correct descriptions of physiology, symptom progression, and pharmacological interventions such as nifedipine for suspected HAPE. The main issue wasn't that the information was wrong, but that the system itself had limits. It worked more like a fixed reference guide than something that could adapt to changing situations. It didn't really connect signals together, and it couldn't weigh multiple warning signs as they built up over time. The key distinction highlighted by the review wasn't the quality of the information, but how it was used. Single readings and checklist thresholds weren't enough to capture a slow, combined decline under hypoxia, fatigue, and a narrowing margin for error. At that altitude, interpretation depends on real-time judgment, not fixed rules. In the final phase of the climb, expedition records and Sherpa accounts indicated progressive physiological decline consistent with severe high-altitude pulmonary edema and secondary hypoxia. At approximately 27,600 feet, evacuation was no longer operationally feasible under prevailing conditions. Her Sherpa followed standard protocol, securing her on the fixed line and descending for assistance. But recovery was not possible when support arrived. Her body was not recovered, in accordance with established high-altitude expedition procedures in the region. A broader post-incident analysis emphasized that while her planning framework and reference materials were accurate, they functioned as static guidance rather than dynamic decision support. The key limitation was the inability to synthesize evolving physiological signals in real time under extreme environmental stress. The case has since been used in safety discussions as an example of the gap between structured, data-driven planning and the cognitive demands of high-altitude decision-making. It underscores that above 26,000 feet, the death zone, physiology deteriorates continuously, and the margin for error is minimal, making integrated judgment more critical than any pre-built system or reference model.